What's up, THS? I'm Mrs. Smith from the library. Our theme for this week is Even If It Doesn't Rhyme, and these are my top three. So, April is National Poetry Month, and I know you don't care about that. I barely care about that myself, but what I do care about is poetry. And this month is as good a time as any to tell you about the three great books of collected poems that I have picked for you for this video. Poetry can take all kinds of formats. Some poems have structure and rules, and some are the opposite of that, and they're all good, so let's get into it. Now, I can't tell you about this first book without shouting out a THS grad from the class of 2020 who discovered this author and asked if we could get her books in the library. Annabelle and Cecilia and Aaliyah were our test readers for this book, and I think right away they knew that we had something really good on our hands. Our first book, book number 3, is called The Nectar of Pain by Nejwa Zebian. What a beautiful title, right? The Nectar of Pain. And if you take a second to think about those words, you've already gotten the first taste of what waits for you in this book of poetry and prose. Zebian is writing about the hurt and the grief, the rejection, the loss, the feelings of being on the outside that we all experience at some point in our life. But then there's also the nectar inside of that. Like, that's the sweet stuff, the good part, the beautiful things that we take away from those experiences that may cause us some not so beautiful emotions. Now, like most poets that we know and love, Nejwa Zebian got her start at a young age, putting those thoughts, that internal conflict of feeling like on the outside and not part of the group, on paper. And that eventually becomes like this work of poetry that she published under the title The Nectar of Pain. And all the stuff about poems that move us, the honesty, the vulnerability, the hurt. Allen Ginsberg said that poets take the private world and they make it public. And so all of those feelings that we tend to keep and process on the inside come out in this book of poetry in a beautiful way that just allows us to commiserate and feel seen and feel like we're not alone, which is it's just one of the beautiful things about reading words that other people have written. So The Nectar of Pain might be the longest book of poetry on our list. Well, it's the longest for this video for sure. There are 100 or more poems in this book. Please don't feel like you have to start at page 1 and read all the way through to the end. Just read what moves you. Look at the table of contents, flip through it. If this is like a new format for you, go ahead and take your time and just like dig into this wonderful book, the first book on our list for this week, The Nectar of Pain by Nejwa Zebian. Now, there are 2 books of poetry that are very well loved here at THS. So much so that I have to buy new copies of them every year, just because you guys love them so much that you don't bring them back. And that's okay. I'll continue to buy copies of Milk and Honey and The Sun and All Her Flowers as much as you all want to keep reading these great collections of poems by Rupi Kaur. She writes poems that make people feel seen. People like you, people like me, like Emma Watson, like Sam Smith. Once again, it's taking the private world and making it public and putting those emotions on paper. And she has a new book that just came out, and it has the best title. Book number 2 is also by Rupi Kaur, and it's called Homebody. So even if you've never picked up a Rupi Kaur book, you might recognize her work from social media. She's kind of trendy on Instagram and Twitter. People post photos of her drawings. They use lines from her poems as captions for photos. They get her work tattooed on them. Like I said, she just writes things that people can relate to, and I personally am right there in line with those folks. Now, if you are familiar with Kaur's earlier works, then you'll recognize some repeated themes showing up again in Homebody. Big ideas like being a woman, a daughter of immigrants, being in love, um, finding a soulmate, experiencing pain and grief and rejection and loss, and recovering from that and healing from that. Homebody takes the ideas of milk and honey and I think just kind of matures them a little bit. It seems like this third book is a little bit more grown up, a little wiser, but still dealing with those same touchy feely, hippy dippy, totally in my feelings and I'm gonna write about it, poetic thoughts that we talked about with the Nectar of Pain too. So this is another option for you if you're looking for something like that. Book number 2 would be a great choice for you. It's called Homebody by Rupi Kaur. Speaking of homes and bodies, my final pick for this week is another collection of poetry about returning to the self and like always finding a place to come back to after you lose yourself in the world. This book is by Yeskia Salgado and it's called Corazón. If you were to look up Yeskia Salgado and maybe watch one of her YouTube, like a live recording of her reading a poem or her TED Talk, you'd hear her introduce herself as a fly, fat, brown girl. And that expression of her identity shows up in her poems in just like the most awesome way. Everything that we've experienced in the world, we've experienced in our bodies, right? And so there's just like this marriage of like, the external and the internal in these poems that's really good and you should read it. The blurb on this book says that it's about the constant hunger for love. And we see that manifest throughout the poems in different ways that are all really beautiful. There's a poem about sharing cookies and coffee with her dad at the beginning of her life and at the end of his life. There's a poem about being at a party and like seeing her friends like dancing and like falling in love at the dance floor, and she feels like the disco ball that can only like reflect the joy and happiness that everybody else is experiencing and she has none of her own. I'm telling you guys, these are really, really good poems. Again, in all 3 of these books, it's just like our personal, private emotions laid bare. And that means something as a writer and also as a reader who's like experiencing these shared emotions with the author of the book that we choose. The poems in Corazón are about and written by a girl who sometimes loves too much or too often or too strong or too fast, but has found a way to return to love even after love has caused her pain. And what better lesson in the world is there than that? I just love it. Love poetry. Yeskia Salgado has 2 other books, Tesoro and Hermosa, and they both have beautiful covers like this one that I'm obsessed with. But for this week, I wanted to highlight Corazón, her first book, and that will top off our list for books of poetry for this week's video. So perhaps trying a collection of poems would be a new journey for you. If that's the case, then that's good. You should definitely try it. If you are a poetry OG and you've just been waiting for the new Rupi Kaur to come to our library, it is here waiting for you as well. Either way, you should definitely consider reading one of these 3 books of poetry that I've suggested. If these 3 are not for you, send me an email. We can work together to find you a book that might be a better fit. That's all I have for you for this week. I will be back next week with some more book talks for you from our library. Until then, take care. Bye-bye.